Hello children, hope you've had a really nice weekend. Hope you enjoyed the really lovely weather, managed to play outside. Thank you for joining me now. I said last week we were going to read a slightly longer story, so I have chosen a Roald Dahl book, The Magic Finger. Now it's a long time since I read this one, but I hope you haven't read it and I hope you enjoy it. So we will read the first part today, and then we will carry on tomorrow and Wednesday, later on in the week. So we'll start with page 1, the magic finger. So here we've got a group of children and they lived on a farm. So the farm next to ours is owned by Mr. and Mrs. Gregg. The Greggs have 2 children. Both of them are boys. Their names are Philip and William. Sometimes I go over to their farm to play with them. I'm a girl and I am 8 years old. Philip is also 8 years old. William is 3 years older. He is 10. What? Oh, all right then. He is 11. Last week, something very funny happened to the Gregg family, and I'm going to tell you about it as best I can. Okay, so you can see the pictures there. There she is. There she is. And we've got the Gregg family as well here. Now, the one thing that Mr. Gregg and his 2 boys loved to do more than anything else was to go hunting. Every Saturday morning, they would take their guns and they would go off into the woods to look for animals and birds to shoot. Even Philip, who was only 8 years old, had a gun of his own. I can't stand hunting. I just can't stand it. It doesn't seem right to me that men and boys should kill animals just for the fun of it. So I used to try and stop Philip and William from doing it. Every time I went over to their farm, I would do my best to talk them out of it, but they only laughed at me. I even said something about it once to Mr. Gregg, but he just walked past me as if I wasn't even there. Then one Saturday morning, I saw Philip and William coming out of the woods with their father, and they were carrying a deer. This made me so cross that I started shouting at them. The boys laughed and made faces at me, and Mr. Gregg told me to go home and mind my own business. Well, that I did. I saw red. And before I was able to stop myself, I did something I never meant to do. I put the magic finger on them. Oh dear, I even put it on Mrs. Gregg, who wasn't there. I put it on the whole family. For months, I've been telling myself that I would never put the magic finger upon anyone again, not after what happened to my teacher, old Mrs. Winter. Poor old Mrs. Winter. You see, one day we were in class and she was teaching us spelling. Stand up, she said to me, and spell cat. That's an easy one, I said. K-A-T. You silly little girl, Mrs. Winter said. I'm not a silly little girl, I cried. I'm a very nice little girl. Go and stand in the corner, Mrs. Winter said. Then I got cross and I saw red and I put the magic finger on Mrs. Winter, good and strong, and almost at once, guess what? So we can see Mrs. Winter there with the little girl. Whiskers began growing out of her face. They were long, black whiskers, just like the ones you see on a cat, only much bigger. And how fast they grew. Before we had time to think, they were out to her ears. So we've got a picture there of Mrs. Gregg. Sorry, not Mrs. Gregg, Mrs. Winter, with whiskers all over her face. Excuse me. Of course, the whole class started screaming with laughter. And then Mrs. Winter said, will you be so kind as to tell me why you all find this so funny? And then she turned around to write something on the blackboard. We saw that she had grown a tail as well. It was a huge, bushy tail. Can you see the picture of Mrs. Winter there? So she's got her whiskers and she's growing a tail. I cannot begin to tell you what happened after that, but if any of you are wondering, well, Mrs. Winter is quite all right now. The answer is no, and she never, ever will be. The magic finger is something that I've been able to do all of my life. I just can't tell you how I do it because I don't even know myself. But it always happens when I get cross, when I see red, then I get very, very hot all over. Then the tip of my forefinger on my right hand begins to tingle most terribly. So it starts tingling. And suddenly, a sort of flash comes out of me, a quick flash like something electric. It jumps out and touches the person who has made me cross. So there you can see the picture. And after that, the magic finger is upon him or her and things begin to happen. Well, the magic finger was now upon the whole of the Gregg family and there was no taking it off again. I ran home and waited for things to happen. They happened pretty fast. I shall now tell you what those things were. I got the whole story from Philip and William the next morning after it was all over. In the afternoon of the very same day, I put the magic finger on the Gregg family. Mr. Gregg and Philip and William went out hunting once again. This time they were going after ducks, so they headed towards the lake. In the first hour, they got 10 birds, and the next hour they got another 6. What a day, cried Mr. Gregg. This is the best yet. He was beside himself with joy. Just then, 4 more wild ducks flew over their heads. They were flying very low, and they were easy to hit. Bang, 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 went the guns. The ducks flew on. We missed, said Mr. Gregg. That's funny. Then, to everyone's surprise, the 4 ducks turned round and came flying back at them. Hey, said Mr. Gregg, what on earth are they doing? They're really asking for it this time. He shot at them again. So did the boys. And again, they all missed. Mr. Gregg got very red in the face. It's the light, he said. It's getting too dark to see. Let's go home. So they all started for home, carrying with them the 16 birds. But the 4 ducks would not leave them alone. They now began flying around and around Mr. Gregg and the boys. Mr. Gregg did not like it one bit. Be off, he cried, and he shot at them more times. He simply could not get them. All the way home, those 4 ducks flew around in the sky above their head, and nothing would make them go away. So there we have a picture of those ducks, and I think this is Mr. Gregg here. Late that night, after William and Philip had gone to bed, Mr. Gregg went outside to get some wood for the fire. He was crossing the yard when all at once he heard, guess what, the call of a duck in the sky. He stopped and looked up. The night was very still. There was a thin yellow moon over the trees on the hill, and the sky was filled with stars. Then Mr. Gregg heard the noise of wings flying low over his head, and he saw the 4 ducks against the dark night sky, flying very close together. They were going round and round the house. Mr. Gregg forgot about the firewood and hurried back indoors. He was quite afraid. He did not like what was going on, but he said nothing about it to Mrs. Gregg. All he said was, come on, let's go to bed. I feel tired. So they went to bed and they went to sleep. When morning came, Mr. Gregg was the first to wake up. He opened his eyes. He was about to put out a hand for his watch to see the time, but his hand wouldn't come out. That's funny, he said. Where is my hand? He lay still, wondering what was up. Maybe it hurt his hand in some way. He tried the other hand. That wouldn't come out either. He sat up. Then, for the first time, he saw what he looked like. He gave a yell and jumped out of bed. Mrs. Gregg woke up too, and when she saw Mr. Gregg standing there on the floor, she gave a yell too. I wonder what's happened. For he was now a tiny little man. He was maybe as tall as the seat of a chair, but no taller. And where his arms had been, he had a pair of duck's wings instead. So there is a picture of Mr. Gregg. So he's about the size of the seat on a chair, and he's grown wings, and look how big the bed is. But, cried Mrs. Gregg, going purple in the face. My dear man, what's happened to you? What's happened to both of us, you mean, shouted Mr. Gregg. It was Mrs. Gregg's turn to jump out of bed now. She ran to look at herself in the glass, but she was not tall enough to see it. She was even smaller than Mr. Gregg, and she too had got, yes, you guessed it, wings instead of arms. Oh, sobbed Mrs. Gregg. So there's Mrs. Gregg standing in front of the mirror with wings. This is witch's work, cried Mr. Gregg, and both of them started running around the room, flapping their wings. A minute later, Philip and William burst in. The same thing had happened to them. They had wings and no arms. They were really tiny. They were about as big as robins, so they were about this size. Mama, cheer up, Philip. Look, Mama, we can fly, and they flew up into the air. Come down at once, said Mrs. Gregg. You're much too high. Before she could say another word, Philip and William had flown right out of the window. So there they were, okay, about the same size as a little tiny robin, and they'd flown out of the window. Mr. and Mrs. Gregg ran to the window and looked out. The 2 tiny boys were now high up in the sky. Then Mrs. Gregg said, Mr. Gregg, do you think we could do that, my dear? I don't see why not, Mr. Gregg said. Come on, let's try. Mr. Gregg began to flap his wings hard, and all at once he went up. Then Mrs. Gregg did the same. Help, she cried as she started going up. Save me. Come on, said Mr. Gregg. Don't be afraid. So out the window they flew, far up into the sky, and it did not take them long to catch up with Philip and William. Soon the whole family was flying around together. "Oh, isn't it lovely?" cried William. "I've always wanted to know what it feels like to be a bird." "Your wings are not getting tired, are they, dear?" Mr. Gregg asked Mrs. Gregg. "No, not at all," Mrs. Gregg said. "I could go on forever." "Hey, look down there," said Philip. "Somebody is walking in our garden." They all looked down, and there below them in their own garden, they saw 4 enormous wild ducks. If you look at the picture, you can see the wild ducks walking around in their garden. The ducks were as big as men, and what is more, they had long arms, just like men, instead of wings. The ducks were walking in a line to the door of the Greggs' house, swinging their arms and holding their beaks high in the air. "Stop!" called the tiny Mr. Gregg, flying down low over their heads. "Go away! That's my house." The ducks looked up and quacked. The first one put out her hand and opened the door of the house and went in. The others went in after him and shut the door. So there's the ducks, and they've gone into the house, and there's Mr. Gregg up above. The Greggs flew down and sat on the wall near the door. Mrs. Gregg began to cry. "Oh dear," she sobbed. "They've taken our house. What shall we do? We have no place to go." Even the boys began to cry a bit now. "We'll be eaten by cats and foxes in the night," said Philip. "I want to sleep in my own bed," said William. "Now then," said Mr. Gregg, "it isn't any good crying. That won't help us. Shall I tell you what we're going to do?" "What?" they said. Mr. Gregg looked at them and smiled. "We are going to build a nest." "A nest," they said. "Can we do that?" "We must do it," said Mr. Gregg. "We've got to have somewhere to sleep. Follow me." They flew off to a tall tree. Right at the top of it, Mr. Gregg found the perfect place for a nest. So there we are. You can see Mr. Gregg finding the place at the top of the tree for a nest. We'll read 2 more pages. "Now, we want sticks," he said. "Lots and lots of little sticks. Off you go, all of you, and find them and bring them back here." "But we have no hands," said Philip. "Then use your mouths." Mrs. Gregg and the children flew off. Soon they were back, carrying the sticks in their mouths. Mr. Gregg took the sticks and started to build the nest. "More," he said. "I want more and more and more sticks. Keep going." The nest began to grow. Mr. Gregg was very good at making the sticks stick together. So there's Mr. Gregg, okay, building the nest. After a while, he said, "That's enough sticks. Now I want leaves and feathers and things like that to make it nice and soft." The building of the nest went on and on. It took a long time, but eventually it was finished. "Try it," said Mr. Gregg, hopping back. He was very pleased with his work. "Oh, isn't it lovely?" cried Mrs. Gregg, going into it and sitting down. "I feel I may lay an egg at the moment." The others all got in beside her. "How warm it is," said William. "And what fun to be living up so high," said Philip. "We may be small, but nobody can hurt us up here." "That's right," Mr. Gregg said. "So we will fly now back to the house and go in by an open window and get the tin of biscuits when the ducks aren't looking." "Oh, we'll be pecked to bits by those dirty great ducks," cried Mrs. Gregg. "We shall be very careful, my love," said Mr. Gregg, and off they went. But when they got to the house, they found all the doors and the windows were closed. There was no way in. So there are the Greggs in their nest, and we will carry on tomorrow. So I thought for the older children, we read a slightly longer story. Roald Dahl's books are always amusing. I'm sure some of you have already read his book. So we'll carry on tomorrow. So I hope you'll join me again at 4 o'clock. Thank you, children. Enjoy the rest of your day and see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.